The views and opinions expressed on any program are those of the producers and/or the persons appearing on the program and do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of FRC Media, Bristol Community College, or the City of Fall River.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Keith Tebow at FRC Media. You know, FRC Media here, we're always involved during election season, be it a local Fall River city election, a state election, or as is the case every 4 years, and as is the case in 2024, it is a presidential election. We are creating a series of programs between now and Election Day that'll give you some historical background on presidential elections, as well as we'll talk a little bit about some of the issues as we head closer toward November. We are doing this with a partner of ours here at Bristol Community College. I'm pleased to be joined by Associate Professor of History and Government, Don Kilguss. Don, thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to help.
So Don, I actually want to start about, I want to talk a little bit about the history.
Okay.
A lot of it, history of our country, and then, as we delve into the series, we'll get into more about some specific issues that may be part of the campaign, and that's going to change a lot between now and November, without a doubt. But in terms of how did this country get to be a democratic republic and having the three branches of government? Then we'll talk specifically about presidency.
Okay. Well, we actually have a long history of representative government in this country. It dates back to the House of Burgesses in 1619 in the colony of Virginia, which obviously is influenced and impacted by what we experienced with the British government as we settled here and as a product of the British experiment, as always, and their evolution in government. But what happened after the Revolution and during the Revolution is there was a huge anti-executive feeling in this country, obviously because we're fighting the war against England and King George III became the great villain of that conflict. So as a result, the constitutions in the states that developed afterwards were very much anti-executive. They were very much pro-legislatures, and therefore the national government that we created during the Revolution was very much decentralized. The Articles of Confederation was a very decentralized form of government where the states had the primary responsibility and the primary powers in government. But we also look back and we realized that government was going to be too weak going forward. So what happens is and we had so many great problems we had to deal with, from huge national debt, trying to expand across into the Western lands and all those issues that government couldn't really deal with. So what happens is in the 1787, they decided that we needed to draft a revised constitution when we got to the Philadelphia Convention, they ripped it up and started fresh, quite frankly. And they were influenced by the state experiences during the Revolution, our history with Great Britain, obviously, but they also were influenced by a lot of other things. And one of the great thinkers in terms of government history is Montesquieu, the Baron de Montesquieu. Right. And he argued about having a separation of powers to prevent tyranny. So you want to separate the lawmaking, the law enforcing, and the law interpreting powers of government. So when they did get together in Philadelphia, that was one of the things they looked at. One of the big questions in the debates was, okay, great, we understand that. How do you make this happen?
Right. How
do you create the Congress? How do you represent the states in both bodies, if there will be two bodies? We thought maybe one. We didn't know at the time.
Right.
So what about the executive? How do you create the executive branch? What is the election going to look like? All those kinds of questions they had a debate from May until finally, with some breaks here and there, obviously, until the Constitution was signed on September 17th.
Right. And it's interesting, in the formulation of the executive branch, which is the President of the United States.
Correct.
There were, powers that were set up that were specifically under his, and I'll still use the male connotation there, his purview. But with the oversights, we talk about checks and balances of the legislative body. I don't want to get into the weeds here, but I want to get right into how they decided to elect the president. So talk about that. And that involves, of course, what we know now as the Electoral College, as well as people voting.
Right, exactly. Well, see, this is the issue. The Constitution, when you think about the Constitutional Convention and the document that was drafted, it is a compromise document. So there were a lot of discussions and compromises. Right. There were discussions about how to elect this president, which is our main focus here, obviously. And the one possibility was have the national legislature elect the president. Well, they didn't care for that too much because what they thought was he or she in the future would be too much under the control of the legislative branch. They thought about maybe direct election by the people, but in 1787, they were fearful that one person might not be able to be known well enough around the country to actually get a majority of the vote. So that kind of led us to the Electoral College. And there are other examples, like our Electoral College is the second oldest in the world to the Sacred College, which is what elects the Pope, obviously when a Pope passes away, and that dates back to 1059. So when they decided to draft this Electoral College, they wanted to give the states the power because, as I always say in my classes, this is the President of the United States. And therefore, the states have the ability in the Constitution to choose electors. They didn't say how, but they said that they can choose electors. So what the states have done and what will happen in terms of as they choose these electors is that for each state gets an elector for each member of the House and Senate that that state has. Mm-hmm. And I'll get into the total numbers and stuff in a few minutes. So what happens is every election year today, for example, both parties and the third parties as well will choose a slate of electors equal to the number of electoral votes that that state has. And it will be different. The Democrats will have one set of individuals, the Republicans will have another, and all the other parties will have theirs as well. And then based on the popular vote of the state on election day, that will determine which set of electors will actually vote in the Electoral College, based on a winner-take-all basis. So if you win the election by one popular vote, you'll win all of that state's electoral votes. Right. So, which I think is an interesting thing. So when people say that your vote doesn't matter, popular vote doesn't matter, that's really not true with the Electoral College debate as it rages, because it will determine which set of electors will actually vote in the Electoral College that year.
You talk about the winner-take-all for the electors, but I believe two states?
Correct.
Nebraska and Maine, I believe, do it a little differently.
They use it based on what's called a district system. And what they do basically is they will set aside 2 electoral votes for the overall winner of the state, popular vote. Mm-hmm. Then what they do is they look at each of their congressional districts, and whichever candidate wins the majority of the popular vote in each district will also get an electoral vote. So that's why sometimes you see candidates when they're looking for every electoral vote that they can find, and I'm thinking more recent elections when things have been so close, you'll see them go to Maine, you'll see them go to Nebraska, and you're thinking, well, why are they going to do that? Because they might get 1, they might get 2, based in these areas. Right, and that can be, we've seen that happen recently, that can be the difference, absolutely.
Now, how long has that been the case in those 2 states? Is that relatively?
Within the last 100 years, within the last 100 years.
And I'm sure there have been some years where they've been split, right?
They have. I mean, the last few elections, they have been split. Right. They have been. And again, you see that often when you're talking about congressional districts in very urban areas versus more rural communities as well.
Right. Now, a lot of local news stories, and we're not going to get into it right now, but a lot of local news stories call into question, and even the past few presidential elections, the qualifications on who can run for president. And it's pretty well laid out, in the Constitution, and there's pretty much no deviation from that. So talk about that.
No, there are 3 qualifications. Age, you must be at least 35. There's no top end to that, but at least 35 years of age. 14 years a resident. Okay, not consecutively. You could have been born in the United States, traveled all over the world, come back, lived as long as it's 14 years total in the United States. And lastly, you must be a natural-born citizen. Those are the only 3 qualifications. So there's nothing else that they can look at in terms of your qualifications to serve as president. So,
I do want to bring up briefly, recently, we're recording this in early June. Recently, President Trump was convicted as in that case in New York. And some people are saying he's a felon, he cannot serve. That's not the case.
That's not the case. In many states, they have their own laws regarding governors, mayors, and other individuals, for example. Who can vote is determined by the state. So whereas someone can run for office in many states, regardless of what their conviction history is, they might not be able to vote for themselves. Which I find interesting. So, so you see it, and every state's a little bit different, but in terms of the federal government, and I haven't seen anything recently about that in terms of any other interpretations. I'm sure everyone will come out with different interpretations limitations between now and November. But those are the three criteria in terms of, qualifications to serve as president.
Now, in terms of the Electoral College, there are a certain number of electors total, and you need to get a majority of that.
Correct.
Talk about those numbers now.
Okay.
And I guess, a lot of discussion around, there's been a lot of discussion in the past few election cycles about getting rid of the Electoral College and going to a straight, winner-take-all vote. Talk about why those in support of the Electoral College as well are in support of the current method that we have.
Right. Well, first of all, the Electoral College, as I said before, there is one electoral vote that is given to each state for every member of the House of Representatives and senator that each state has.
Right.
So every state has 2 senators. So you start with 2, as the smallest states have at least 3, because they have 1 rep and then 2.
At least one, right.
Correct. So basically there are 435 members of the House of Representatives. That number was fixed in 1929.
Right.
And there are 100 senators. So that gives us 535 electoral votes.
Right.
Well, as I often talk with my students, I say that, these are the numbers, and they say, but the real number of votes is 538. And I said, does anyone know why? And after going back and forth a little bit, finally we get to the point is that in 1961, the 23rd Amendment gave the District of Columbia, which is not a state, it's its own federal district, 3 electoral votes. So we are up to 538. So in order for anyone to win the presidency, they need not to win more than their opponent. They need to win a majority of all the electoral votes cast.
Right.
So today, that would be 270 electoral votes. So when the electors come together, for example, now we do our thing in November and we vote for president, our popular vote. Actually, you're voting for the electors.
Right.
Because if you go in and look at the ballot, it says electors for so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. So you elect the group of electors, whether Democrat, Republican, or other parties. And then it's those individuals. And Massachusetts has 11 electoral votes. It would be those 11 individuals that would go to the state capitol in December, and they would then vote twice. They vote for 2 individuals, at least one of whom cannot be in the state, cannot be a state resident as well. They put that in there because they didn't want the Electoral College to become so provincial back in the late 17, early 1800s,
right,
that everyone just voted for their own state individuals and no one ever got a majority. So you'd vote for 2 individuals. And then what happens is, so the Electoral College meets in 51 different places, the state capitals and DC.
Right.
Then what they do is they cast their votes, they seal the votes, and send them on to the President of the Senate. Well, the President of the Senate is actually the Vice President of the United States. Correct, correct. And so what happens at that point is that votes are counted. Normally what happens is the Vice President doesn't sit there and count the votes, him or herself.
Right.
What happens is they have 2 tellers, Democrat, Republican, who sit there and count the votes, but it's the Vice President who officially states who has been elected. And that occurs on January 6th or January 7th, in case the January 6th is a Sunday.
So I just want to follow up on what you said about they vote for 2 individuals. Do
Yes.
they vote for, and we'll get into a little bit more about how the parties have changed and how presidents have been elected in the past. But are the 2 individuals the vice president and the president, or are they 2 individuals that, if for some reason candidate number 2 is not Joe Biden, I'm just using that as an example,
right.
would that person get the electors in that state? I guess I'm...
Well, that's a great question, because according to the original Constitution, nowhere does it mention political parties.
Right.
So as a result, originally, everyone was simply running for president. And in the first couple of elections, it didn't matter because George Washington was there, so no one was going to beat George Washington. And whoever finished second became the vice president, according to the original Constitution. Well, as we get later into the 1790s and George Washington retires, then what we see with the rise of political parties, we see that individuals will not get... there's confusion because now you're voting for 2 individuals, but now you've got 2 parties. So we actually, in the 1796 election, had a Federalist president and a Jeffersonian Republican vice president.
Right.
That would be as if Joe Biden was president today and Donald Trump was vice president today. Yes, okay, I'll just leave it at that. So, but that's my point. So they realized by the late 1790s, early 1800s, after the election of 1800, that they had to change. So the 12th Amendment changes the system. Okay. So now those electors, you're exactly right, will cast 1 vote specifically for someone running for president, and then 1 electoral vote for someone running specifically for vice president. Right. Now both of them need to get that 270. Originally, whoever finished second became VP. Now, no, that's not the case. You have to get a majority of the electoral vote for president to be elected president and for vice president to be elected vice president these days. So that's how they really changed the system. And if no one does get a majority, then they have put in mechanisms to deal with that as well, which
Right.
we can talk about if you'd like at some point.
So the way it is today, when the electors vote in December of 2024, they will be casting two separate votes?
Two, yes.
Right, one for president and one for vice president.
Correct.
Got it. Okay, that clears that up a little bit.
Okay.
So you need the majority of 270
Correct.
for both parties.
Correct.
So, I want to get into a little bit more of the history of presidential elections. So I guess before we do that, because this plays into my question in some ways. So if for some reason the electors are counted and it is, 269, 269, what happens?
And then there are two electoral votes out there,
Whatever, right.
a third-party candidate gets it.
Whatever.
Which again, we
this
saw
time?
that potential with, for example, with Ross Perot running a couple decades ago, Ralph Nader. They tend to drain off support from one party or another. Well, what would happen in that case? The 12th Amendment again kicks in and governs a lot of this as well. What happens is for president, the election would then go to the House of Representatives, and in the House of Representatives, the members would vote as states. So the 9 individuals who represent Massachusetts would have to decide who they were going to throw their support to, the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate. I don't think there's a huge question who that would be, but in this case, right. Then in other states, they would do exactly the same thing. And to be elected president, what you'd have to do is win a majority of the state's votes. So in other words, 26.
Does DC play a role in this?
See, that they really don't have a role in that, and this hasn't happened since DC has actually had the 3 electoral votes. So that would be an interesting question, because I'm sure those 3 electoral votes, they would want to have their say, and I'm sure there would be arguments to say that they should be counted, and therefore there'd be 51. So therefore, you still need to get the 26 states. It wouldn't change that kind of mathematics.
Right.
On the other side, if there was a tie, for example, or no one received a majority for the vice president, it would go to the U.S. Senate, which makes sense because the vice president presides over the Senate. So that would make sense that the Senate would have a role in this. And in that case, it would be the senators would vote as individuals because every state has 2, as we mentioned. So whoever wins a majority of the senators' votes would then be elected. So today, someone would need 51 out of the 100 senators' votes. Again, how DC would figure in that case, I have no idea. I think it would be interesting to see how they would argue that and the legal, the wranglings that would go into that as well.
Right. And I believe there had been 2 elections that
Yes.
the election had to be decided by the House
Correct.
early on 1800s, right?
It was 1824 because the party system had broken down and everyone was basically representing the same ideas, basically. And the person, no one won the majority of the electoral vote. It was thrown to the House. And then what happened is John Quincy Adams from Massachusetts was elected president. That also then put into motion arguments of a corrupt bargain that, quite frankly, Jackson, who was the more popular choice, had been cheated, and then led to his rise to power in his election in 1828 and 1832. Yeah. Then also there was a vice presidential election that was decided under the 12th Amendment in 1836, when the individual running for vice president, he actually did not receive the electoral votes of a state because he had taken a former slave as his common law wife, and therefore the state of Virginia denied him their electoral votes. Eventually, in that race, he was also elected in 1836 by the Senate to become the new vice president.
I want to get into, with a few minutes we do have left.
Okay.
We talk about presidential elections. We focus a lot on November, but there's a lot going on, from January to the conventions, which we're going to get to in our next tapings. And that has to do a lot with the primaries and caucuses. How did those come to be?
Well, it's interesting. That's one other aspect that is not mentioned in the Constitution. I mentioned earlier, just as an aside, how the states choose their electors was not mentioned. Just said the states have to choose electors. Right. What they've done now is they've said, okay, we're going to use the state popular vote to choose which electors. They've done different things in the past. Well, what has happened as well, there never was a way to decide who was going to be the nominee for president, who were going to be presidential nominees. So what evolved over time in the early American government was what was called the Congressional or the King Caucus, which it would be the members of the House and Senate that would come together and meet and would decide, okay, we're going to...
In each individual state?
No, in the U.S. Congress. They would meet down in the U.S. Congress.
Okay.
And they would come together and they would decide that we want this person and we want this person and so on and so forth. Well, the problem with that is it doesn't involve the people at all.
Right.
It also violates the whole premise, the whole basis of that separation of powers, because now you have individuals from Congress basically limiting the pool and saying, well, we just want these couple individuals to actually be the ones who are able to run for president. So in the early 20s, that system stayed for a long time, and eventually in the early 20th century, during the Progressive era, where there was a big push to return the government to the American people, that's when the primaries evolved, where quite frankly, the primaries are just basically an election to choose who the nominee of the party will be from that particular state. So now it's at the state level, like you mentioned. And then the caucuses are used in some as well, where they're more informal. It's not like an election per se, where literally they're in different types of, at times they're in homes, they're in other areas where people literally come together and they kind of group themselves up. And they kind of go through a couple different rounds to say who we actually think we want to represent us and be the nominee. Right. And sometimes that can change. And literally you have, in rooms, you sometimes have some group over here representing one candidate, and they go and try to appeal to this other group to say, well, come over with us, and then we'll gain more support. And, so it's an interesting system. And obviously the most famous caucus is in Iowa, and the most famous primary is the first one in New Hampshire all the time. So it makes it interesting to see how this has evolved in American government over the years. And that's, again, trying to bring the power and the authority back to the American people.
And you mentioned the caucuses. I believe there were some states, I don't know if it was this election cycle or the previous, and I'm thinking of Nevada. I think Nevada used to have a caucus and now they have a primary, or there's both? Is there one state that I believe has
each
both?
party can do different things. And
Right,
I remember in Nevada, I think that might be, in all honesty,
sure.
I don't know off the top of my head, but I believe one party may have a primary and one may have a caucus instead in Nevada, because I do remember hearing about that, but it didn't, because at that time it was pretty much, we knew who the presumptive nominees were at that point, obviously. But it's interesting because each state can change, and they can change their dates of when the primaries are going to happen or the caucus is going to happen, but the parties sometimes want them in a certain order, so sometimes states can be punished by the party if they do certain things that the party doesn't care for and things like that. So, but you see, that's, again, this is the whole process, and this is where one of the arguments, because you mentioned this earlier to me about for and against the Electoral College, that argument, we didn't really address that earlier. That, keeping the Electoral College, there are reasons to do it, obviously. One is it maintains, at least theoretically, that whole idea that the states are choosing who this president will be, even though directly it's the American people who are, with their popular vote, determining the electors and so on and so forth. There is the idea that if someone ever passed away between the election and between when the electors actually get together in the Electoral College, what would happen if it was a direct popular vote instead? The Electoral College would decide in that case. The party would, put up another candidate, which has happened. It has happened. We had a presidential candidate die once, and we actually had, just before the election itself, a vice presidential candidate die. So these things can happen, obviously. There are other arguments about the Electoral College in terms of helping to limit the amount if there's any kind of voter fraud. Because then it limits that contamination, quote unquote, to just the popular votes of that particular state. The argument against it, obviously, is the idea of where the government has been going for the last 200 years, giving the American people more of a direct say over who the executive of this country will be, or just in general. I mean, originally, U.S. senators were not elected by the American people. That changed in 1917. So you see all of these different, 17th Amendment, excuse me, I said 1917, that was actually 1913. But, you see all these things actually happening, and so that's one of the major arguments. Another one, about the direct, the idea of the direct popular vote is that those who support the popular vote, that's out, the national popular vote, I always mess that up. National Popular Vote Compact, which is out there that says that if they get enough states to sign on to it, that actually those states are binding themselves to say that in these elections in the future, we will not cast our electoral votes based upon what our popular vote states, but by the national popular vote. And I think that's an interesting thing, because while it sounds great on paper, and theoretically, how are people going to feel in a state that's generally very Republican or very Democrat if all of a sudden their electoral votes are now being sent to this other person? I mean, I think that's going to be something that's interesting that maybe they don't think about that long term.
Let me ask you, we talk a lot about, when there are presidential elections, the Democrats and the Republicans. Other parties can have candidates placed on the ballot as well?
Yes.
And can someone who's just unaffiliated run for president? And how does that work?
Well, absolutely. What you have to do is every state has different regulations about how you actually get on the ballot in a particular state. It always comes down to a certain number of signatures, and they have to be verified as voters and residents of the state, and so on and so forth. So every state's a little bit different in terms of the number that they need. And for example, one person, because of his family name, obviously, and the notoriety, is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's running right now. And he's on the ballot in many states. I haven't looked lately in terms of actually how many states he's on, but he is someone that I think might be in the line of someone like a Ross Perot or someone like a Ralph Nader, who ran in the 90s, and Ralph Nader in the 2000s, that could have an issue where he could siphon off some votes. Whether he wins electoral votes or not, that's a question, because the last time there was actually someone who won electoral votes as a third-party candidate has been since 1968. So that's a long time to go. And you think someone like Ross Perot, when he was on Larry King every other day, it seemed.
He got a lot of votes.
He was out there and he got a lot of votes, but he never got up to that number.
So I want to end our first episode here. One of the things that I can guarantee is, as we move along, we will get into the issues of the campaign. And we're going to be as nonpartisan as we can. Sometimes that may be difficult just because people talk and things will happen. So just so you know, we're going to be doing a program pretty much every month between now and Election Day. Over the next couple of months, we're going to be focusing on the Republican convention in July, the Democratic convention in August. And that we can talk a little bit more about the issues around those two parties. So we'll be doing that. And then we have some other ideas of what we're going to go throughout the fall, but we will save those for another time. Don, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We look forward to seeing you next time.
Sounds great.
All right.
Sounds great.
And thank you for joining us here on FRC Media. I'm Keith Tebow. Have a great day.